The words hit Lavinia Harper like a bullet she never saw coming. She stood at the edge of Wesley Keller's property, her traveling bag still clutched in both hands, her knuckles white against the worn leather strap, and she stared at the man who had just said the most terrifying, most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. The afternoon sun was burning down on the Colorado plains, the tall grasses bending sideways in the dry August wind of 1882, and Wesley was standing 20 feet away from her with his hat in his hands, his dark eyes steady and patient and absolutely certain. And he had just turned toward that modest ranch house of his and gestured at the new addition on the eastern end and said, without apology or pretense or any of the careful social maneuvering she had come to expect from men, "I built that second room for when you stay, not if, when." Lavinia felt the betrayal of her own heart before she felt anything else, because she had come here to leave. She had come here with her bag packed and a decision made and a letter of explanation folded in her coat pocket, and now Wesley Keller was standing in the Colorado afternoon light looking at her with those quiet, honest eyes and talking about a room he had built for her, and every single reason she had lined up so carefully in the privacy of her mind was collapsing like a fence in a flood. She opened her mouth, closed it. The wind pulled a strand of dark hair across her face. "Wesley," she said, and her voice betrayed her too, cracking right down the middle of his name. He did not move closer. He never pushed. That was one of the things that had undone her from the very beginning, back when this whole impossible situation had started 4 months ago in the dusty, desperate little town of Granger's Crossing, when Lavinia Harper had arrived with nothing but a trunk, a secret she was terrified to speak aloud, and a dark past she was absolutely certain would destroy any chance she had at the life she wanted. She had not expected Wesley Keller. She had not expected any of this. It had started with a notice in the Denver Post, the kind of notice that respectable women were not supposed to answer, and yet desperate women answered every single day in 1882. Lavinia had been living in a single rented room above a Denver millinery shop, surviving on alterations work and the careful management of the very last of the money she had inherited from her mother, which was itself the last good thing her mother had left her before dying of fever in the spring of that year. She was 26 years old. She had no family left in the world, and the city of Denver was beginning to feel like a trap she had walked into willingly and could not find the exit of. The notice had read simply, "Rancher in Granger's Crossing, Colorado seeks capable woman, good character, willing to consider permanent arrangement. Fair man, honest house. Write to W. Keller, Box 14, Granger's Crossing." Lavinia had read it 3 times standing at the post office counter, and then she had walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought about it for 2 full days before she wrote back. She had not been honest in her letter. That was the secret she carried. She had described herself accurately in terms of her practical skills and her willingness to work, but she had left out the part about her past that she knew would end the correspondence immediately if she included it. She had left out the part about Marcus Holt. Marcus Holt was the reason Lavinia Harper had a dark past at all. He was the reason she had left St. Louis 3 years ago, the reason she had come to Denver under a different last name for 6 months before reverting to her mother's maiden name when she felt safe enough. And he was the reason she still sometimes woke at 3 in the morning with her heart hammering and her hands reaching for a lamp that was not there. Marcus had been charming and dangerous in equal measure, and Lavinia had been 23 and newly arrived in St. Louis from her father's farm in Missouri, and she had made the worst mistake of her life in trusting him. She had not been his wife, but she had been close enough to it in the eyes of their small social circle that when his criminal activities came to light and the law came looking for everyone associated with him, her name had been spoken in the same breath as his. She had been cleared eventually after weeks of terrifying uncertainty, but the damage to her reputation had been thorough and permanent in St. Louis, and so she had run. She had run to Denver and she had worked, and she had rebuilt herself piece by piece like a woman constructing a house out of whatever materials she could find, and she had almost convinced herself that the past was genuinely behind her. And then she had answered Wesley Keller's notice, and she had come to Granger's Crossing, and everything had become more complicated than she had ever anticipated, in ways she had never expected, and not one single complication had been the kind she had braced herself for. Wesley Keller had met her stage at the Granger's Crossing Depot on a Tuesday morning in April. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had been in the sun so long it was the color of old saddle leather. He was not handsome in any conventional way, but he had a quality of stillness about him that Lavinia noticed immediately, the quality of a man who had learned that the world moved faster than it needed to and had decided not to follow it. He had taken her trunk without being asked, introduced himself without flourish, and driven her to his ranch in a wagon that smelled of hay and wood resin, and in the entire 40-minute drive he had said exactly 11 things, each of them either informative or courteous, none of them performative. Lavinia had counted the things he said. She had been so nervous she needed something to count. Granger's Crossing was a town of perhaps 400 people in 1882, sitting in a valley between two ridgelines in western Colorado, where a creek called Granger's Run came down out of the mountains and flattened out into good cattle country. The town itself had a general store, a church, a post office, a small hotel, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a doctor's office, and a saloon that tried very hard to look like something other than a saloon by posting a sign that said Refreshment Hall above the door, which fooled no one. There was a sheriff named Dodd who was competent and fair, which was not always guaranteed in Colorado in 1882, and a small community of ranchers and farmers and tradespeople who knew each other's business the way people in small western towns always knew each other's business, which was completely and without mercy. Wesley's ranch, the Keller spread, was 4 miles east of town on a flat stretch of land that ran up against a series of low, rocky hills to the north. He ran about 200 head of cattle, had 3 hired hands named Prout, Sal, and a young man of 19 called Tommy Reeves, who had been working for Wesley since he was 16 and treated the ranch like his own. The main house was small but well built, with a kitchen, a sitting room, a single bedroom, and a covered porch that faced west across the grassland. It was, Lavinia thought on the first morning she woke up in the house's sitting room on a folded-out cot that Wesley had arranged with obvious care and fresh linens, the cleanest ranch house she had ever seen, which told her more about Wesley Keller than most things he said directly. The arrangement was supposed to be simple. She would keep the house, help manage the domestic operations of the ranch, and they would determine over a period of time whether a permanent arrangement suited them both. Wesley had written this in his second letter to her with the kind of direct language that Lavinia appreciated even as it made her stomach tight with anxiety, because it meant the arrangement could be ended, which meant she could fail, which meant she might find herself back in Denver with even less than she had left with. What she had not anticipated was how quickly she would come to feel that this place, this land, this quiet man's company, was the most at home she had felt since her mother's farm in Missouri. And that feeling was the most dangerous thing of all, because it meant she had something to lose. The first week passed in the practical work of establishing a routine. Lavinia cooked and cleaned and organized the pantry and made an accounting of the stores, and Wesley went about his ranch work without making her feel observed or tested, which she had feared. His hired hands were respectful, particularly old Prout, who was somewhere past 60 and had rheumatism in both knees, and called her Miss Harper with such consistent formality that she found herself genuinely fond of him by the end of the second day. Sal was quieter and more watchful, a lean, dark-skinned man from Texas who had been working cattle since before Lavinia was born, and Tommy Reeves was young and eager and sometimes forgot himself, and talked too much at supper, which Wesley would redirect with a single quiet look that was somehow never unkind. The evening of the seventh day was when the first real thing happened between them. Lavinia had been sitting on the porch after supper, watching the light go out of the western sky in that slow, spectacular way it did in Colorado, the colors going from orange to deep rose to the specific purple that happened right before full dark, and Wesley had come out and sat in the other chair without asking if she minded, which she found she did not. They sat in silence for a while, and then he said, without preamble, "You're not sleeping well." It was not a question. She could tell from the way he said it that he had noticed the lamp burning late in the sitting room, or perhaps heard her moving around at night, and that he had thought carefully about whether to mention it before deciding that honesty was more respectful than pretending not to notice. She said, "No, I'm not, I'll settle." And then, because his directness was somehow contagious, she said, "I have some things I'm still carrying." He nodded. "Most people do," he said. And then he did not press her, and she did not elaborate, and they sat in the dark together for another half hour, and it was the most companionable silence Lavinia had experienced in 3 years. By the end of the second week, she had begun to understand something that disturbed her considerably, which was that Wesley Keller was a genuinely good man. Not good in the performative way that some men were, the men who made a show of their goodness like a suit of clothes they were inviting you to admire, but good in the structural way, where it went all the way through. He was fair to his workers and paid them on time. He gave credit at his word and kept every commitment she observed him making. He was kind to the horses with the unthinking naturalness of a man who did not require an audience for his kindness. And he looked at Lavinia Harper in a way that she found increasingly difficult to interpret, which was to say, he looked at her like she was worth looking at, worth listening to, worth the specific quality of attention he was giving her, and he never made that feel like something she owed him anything for. She was beginning to be terrified of how much she wanted to stay. The trouble arrived in the third week in the form of a letter that came addressed to her at the Granger's Crossing post office, in handwriting she recognized with a jolt of cold dread that started in her chest and traveled all the way down to her feet. The postmaster's wife, a talkative woman named Mrs. Beaumont, handed it across the counter with the particular bright interest of someone who had noticed the letter was from St. Louis, and Lavinia had taken it and walked out of the post office and stood in the street and stared at it for a long moment before she opened it. Marcus Holt had found her. The letter was not threatening in its language, which made it more threatening. It was written with Marcus's characteristic smooth confidence, the tone of a man who believed that the world would eventually arrange itself according to his preferences. He wrote that he had business interests in Colorado now, that he would be passing through the region in the coming weeks, that he thought it would be agreeable to renew their acquaintance. He referenced, with elegant indirection, the fact that he knew where she was, the name under which she was living, and the nature of her current arrangement. The implication was clear. He wanted something. He had not yet said what. Lavinia burned the letter in the kitchen stove that afternoon and stood watching it turn to ash and thought with a cold clarity that her time in Granger's Crossing might already be coming to an end. If Marcus Holt came here and began to speak about her history, the carefully reconstructed life she had been building would be destroyed as thoroughly as the letter in the fire. Wesley Keller, who was a known and respected man in this community, could not afford the association with a woman who had been connected, however unjustly, to a criminal in another state. And if she stayed and let that happen, she would be repaying his kindness and his trust with damage she had no right to bring to his door. The logical thing, the protective thing, was to leave before Marcus arrived. She began making her plans quietly over the next several days, and the terrible irony was that this was exactly the period during which Wesley began to show her, in his characteristically unannounced and undramatic way, that he had feelings for her that went beyond the practical terms of their arrangement. It started with small things. He began asking her opinion on decisions about the ranch, not as a courtesy, but with the genuine interest of a man who thought her perspective had value. He found reasons to be near the house in the late afternoon when the work was done, timing that had not been the pattern before. He brought her back a length of blue cotton from the general store one afternoon without explanation, setting it on the kitchen table when she was not in the room, and when she asked about it, he said only that he had noticed the blue she wore suited her, and then he went back outside before she could respond, which she found so endearing she had to sit down. And he told her things about himself, slowly and without ceremony, in the evening hours on the porch or over the supper table when the hands had gone. He told her that he had come to Colorado from Kansas at the age of 22 with $140 and a working knowledge of cattle and very little else. He told her about the first winter on the ranch, which had been brutal and lonely and had nearly broken him twice. He told her about his father, who had been a hard and largely silent man who loved his family in the way that some men loved things, which was to say adequately but without ever quite finding the words for it, and how Wesley had spent a long time being the same way before deciding that the silence was a habit he could choose to change. That last confession, delivered on a warm evening in May with the first fireflies appearing in the grass, made Lavinia feel something so sharp and specific that she had to look away from him to hide her expression. She was falling in love with Wesley Keller. She had been falling in love with him for weeks, probably from somewhere around the 7th day, and the realization made her immediate situation feel like a trap closing around her, because the more she loved him, the more it would cost her to leave, and the more it would cost him if she stayed and Marcus Holt arrived and tore everything apart. The second letter came from Marcus 12 days after the first. It was delivered directly to the ranch this time, handed to Tommy Reeves at the gate by a rider the young man did not recognize, which meant Marcus was either already in the territory or had people in the territory who were acting for him. This letter was less elegant in its indirection. Marcus wrote that he would be arriving in the Granger's Crossing area within the fortnight, that he had a proposal for Lavinia, that she would find it in her interest to hear, and that it would be considerably to her benefit to speak with him before anyone else became involved in the conversation. Lavinia read this letter alone in the kitchen with the morning sun coming through the window and making ordinary gold patterns on the floor, and thought, he wants money. Or he wants a name, a contact, someone she might have met in Colorado that he wanted access to. Marcus had always been fundamentally transactional, and whatever he was coming to her for, it was because he believed she had something he could use. She thought about telling Wesley. She turned it over and over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking at all its faces. She imagined sitting down with him and beginning with, "There is something I should have told you when I arrived," and watching his face as she explained Marcus Holt and St. Louis and the whole sordid business of her compromised past, and she simply could not get past the image of what his expression might do, how the particular quality of his regard for her might change, and she was a coward about that. She knew she was being a coward. She knew it clearly, and she did it anyway. She packed her bag. She wrote the letter of explanation that she intended to leave on the kitchen table, something that said enough to let him understand without saying everything, something that thanked him for his decency and apologized for the disruption, and wished him well in terms that she hoped did not reveal too clearly what she was actually feeling as she wrote it. She put the letter in her coat pocket. And then she walked out the front door of the ranch house on an August afternoon in 1882 with her bag in her hands, and Wesley Keller was standing in the yard watching her come, and he turned and looked across the field toward the eastern end of the house and said, "I built that second room for when you stay." And the world stopped. She stared at him. She looked at the room. It was undeniably new, the wood a lighter color than the rest of the house, the construction careful and solid, a window on the east side that would catch the morning light. He had been building it for weeks. She had noticed the sounds of construction and had assumed he was making repairs, and now she understood that he had been building a room with a specific person in mind, A room for her. A room that said in timber and nails what Wesley Keller could not quite say yet in plain speech, which was that he wanted her to stay permanently and wanted her to have a proper room of her own, a room that was hers. "Wesley," she said, and her voice broke. He crossed the distance between them in a few measured steps. He stood close enough that she could see the careful set of his jaw, the slight tension around his eyes that told her he was afraid, which she had never seen on him before and which made him more human to her in that moment than he had ever been. "I know you're planning to go," he said quietly. "I've been watching you plan to go for a week. You get a particular look when you're making decisions you've already made." He glanced at the bag in her hands. "Whatever it is you're carrying that's making you think you need to leave, I'd like you to tell me about it before you go. That's all I'm asking." The tears that had been building in Lavinia's chest since the moment he had said those words about the room finally arrived at her eyes. She did not cry easily and had not cried in public since her mother died, and the fact that she was about to cry now in Wesley Keller's front yard in the August afternoon was so precisely characteristic of how thoroughly he had undone her defenses that she almost laughed at herself. "You don't know what you're asking," she said. "Then tell me," he said, "and let me decide." It was the "let me decide" that did it. That was the thing that reached past all her careful self-protection and found the part of her that had been trying to make every decision alone for 3 years, the part that was so tired of the weight of it. She set her bag down in the dirt. She told him everything. It took a long time and it was not graceful, the way the truth rarely is when it has been held back long enough to build pressure. She told him about St. Louis and Marcus Holt, about how she had been young and trusting and wrong about a man in a way that had cost her everything she had built at that time. She told him about the investigation and the weeks of fear and the clearing of her name that had come too late to save her reputation. She told him about Denver and the slow reconstruction, about the loneliness of it, about answering his notice because she was out of other options and had decided that trying was better than not trying. She told him about the letters from Marcus, and as she said that she watched his jaw tighten slightly, but he did not interrupt. When she finished, she was looking at the ground because she could not look at his face during the worst of it, and now she made herself look up, bracing for the change she had been dreading. Wesley was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. It was not the easy, uncomplicated regard she was used to. There was something working behind his eyes, something being decided. Then he said, "None of that is about your character. That's about someone else's crimes and your bad luck in crossing paths with him." She breathed out. "Other people don't see it that way." "Other people aren't the ones being asked for an opinion," he said, which was so simply, completely, characteristically Wesley that she felt the tears again. "What is it Holt wants?" "I don't know yet. Money, most likely, or the use of my name in some fashion. He trades in connections." Wesley nodded, processing this with the quiet efficiency of a man who was already working the problem. "When is he coming?" His letter said within the fortnight. That was 9 days ago. So any time now. He picked up her traveling bag without ceremony and set it on the porch steps. "Then you're not going anywhere. Not because I'm stopping you," he added quickly, meeting her eyes. "Because if you run, he follows. And you've been running for 3 years and you deserve to stop." Lavinia stood in the yard looking at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, one of the cattle lowed and another answered. "You built a room," she said. "I did." "You built it before I told you any of this." "I did," he said again. "Why?" He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unhurried regard, and then he said, "Because from about the 3rd week onward, I stopped being able to imagine this place without you in it. And I needed to do something with that feeling, and building seemed like a more constructive choice than just saying it out loud and scaring you off." Lavinia Harper had not laughed genuinely in so long that the sound of it surprised her when it came out, bright and real in the afternoon air. Wesley looked startled for exactly 1 second, and then his face did something she had never quite seen it do before, which was break open into a full, unguarded smile that was completely devastating. She said, "Wesley Keller, you are the strangest, most wonderful man I have ever had the misfortune of coming to feel strongly about." He said, "I'll take that." They stood smiling at each other in the yard for a moment, and then the practical reality of Marcus Holt reasserted itself, and they went inside to make a plan. The plan involved Wesley's neighbor, a rancher named George Aldermain, who was on the county council and knew the sheriff well, and Sheriff Dodd himself, who Wesley rode into town to speak with the following morning. Lavinia stayed at the ranch and met with the sheriff when he rode out that afternoon, a straight-backed man of about 50 with a graying mustache and the eyes of someone who had heard most of the stories people had to tell and evaluated them with professional skepticism. She gave him both of Marcus's letters, which she had retrieved from the stove ash, only to find the first one was genuinely gone and had to describe it from memory, and explained the situation with careful accuracy, neither minimizing nor dramatizing. Sheriff Dodd listened to everything, asked 3 questions, and then said, "If this man comes here and attempts to extort you, that's a criminal matter in Colorado, Miss Harper. Your past in St. Louis, as you've described it, doesn't change that." "You were cleared. He knows how to talk around things," she said. "So do I," said the sheriff without particular inflection, and she believed him. The next days were the strangest of all the days she had spent at the Keller ranch, because they were days lived under the shadow of Marcus Holt's approach, which should have made everything anxious and grim, but instead they were days in which something between Wesley and Lavinia that had been building slowly and carefully for months moved with sudden open honesty that felt like a window thrown wide in a room that had been close for too long. They talked. They talked more in those 5 days than they had talked in the whole preceding 4 months, partly because the situation had forced a new candor between them, and partly because the constraint of the unnamed thing they felt for each other had been released by his words about the room and her decision to stay, and now things that had been circling each other finally made contact. He told her about the woman he had come close to marrying when he was 28, a schoolteacher from Denver who had decided, after 3 months on the ranch, that the life was not what she had imagined, and who had left with more grace than pain and taken his confidence in his own worthiness with her when she went. He told her this matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but she could hear the shape of the wound it had made, the way it had taught him to move carefully, to build rather than to speak, to let his actions say things his words were afraid to. She told him about her father's farm, about the particular quality of those Missouri mornings when you could smell the coming heat in the air before the sun was fully up, and how that smell had been the first thing she noticed when she came to Colorado, and it had made her feel, before anything else did, like she might be able to be home here. She told him about her mother, who had been the kind of woman who taught her daughters that independence was not optional, that the ability to provide for yourself was the most important thing you could cultivate, that a woman who could not survive on her own terms would never choose the life she lived out of genuine desire. She said that advice had served her very well and cost her greatly in equal measure, and Wesley had listened, and then said that her mother sounded like someone worth knowing, which made Lavinia miss her mother with a sharpness that she was not prepared for, and Wesley had seen it in her face, and without any awkwardness simply reached across the supper table and covered her hand with his for a moment. And that brief, warm contact was more intimate than anything she had experienced in years. She was deeply, irrevocably in love with him. She knew this with a certainty that had moved past hope or fear into the territory of simple fact. The question now was not what she felt, but what would happen when Marcus Holt arrived, and whether the life she could see the outline of, the life inside the Keller ranch with the new room catching the morning light and the sound of cattle and the evenings on the porch, would still be possible after that confrontation. Marcus arrived on a Friday. He came to the ranch directly, which she had not expected but probably should have, because directness disguised as courtesy was his signature. He came in a hired buggy from town, dressed in a good coat that was slightly too formal for the territory, with his particular brand of handsome confidence that Lavinia had once found compelling and now found as repellent as a dead thing in a water source. She was in the kitchen when Tommy Reeves knocked and said there was a man at the gate, and she looked out the window and felt the cold recognition flood through her and then, surprisingly, recede. Because Wesley came around the corner of the barn at that moment, having seen the buggy from the field, and he walked toward the gate with his particular unhurried stride, and Sheriff Dodd rode up the ranch road behind Marcus's buggy at almost exactly the same time, having been watching the road from town per the arrangement they had made. Marcus Holt stepped down from the buggy and seemed to assess the situation in one quick sweep of the scene, and understood that it had been arranged against him. Lavinia saw his expression shift, the smooth confidence faltering for just a moment before he reassembled it. She went out. She stood on the porch and watched Wesley intercept Marcus at the gate, and she heard Wesley say in that quiet, uninfluenced voice of his, "You're on private property, state your business." Marcus looked past him toward Lavinia on the porch. He tried the smile, the particular version of it that had worked on her at 23, and it had no more effect now than wind on stone. He said, "Lavinia, I've come a long way. I think you can at least hear what I have to say." "Say it here," she said. Marcus looked at the sheriff, who had dismounted and was standing to one side with the specific watchful ease of a lawman waiting to be needed. Then he looked at Wesley, who had not moved from between Marcus and the house, and then he did the calculation, which Lavinia could see him doing, the same calculation he had always done when the odds shifted, and he decided that whatever he had come for was not worth the risk of the current configuration. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding," Marcus said smoothly. "I was simply passing through the territory and thought to say hello to an old friend." "Miss Harper has indicated she does not wish to renew the acquaintance," Wesley said. "I'll ask you to respect that." Marcus looked at Lavinia once more with an expression that had something dark and calculating in it beneath the surface charm, and she held his gaze without flinching, which was something she had practiced for 3 years without knowing when she would need it. Then he looked at Sheriff Dodd. The sheriff said, mildly, "I understand you've sent correspondence to Miss Harper that could be read in a particular way, Mr. Holt. I have those letters. I'd recommend that any further communication with residents of this county be of a clearly legal nature." He paused. "Are you planning to be in Granger's Crossing long?" Marcus Holt got back in his buggy. He said to no one in particular, "Just passing through," and turned the horse and drove back down the ranch road the way he had come. He was gone. It was so simple. That was the thing that struck Lavinia as she stood on the porch and watched the buggy diminish down the road and disappear around the line of cottonwoods. 3 years of fear, 3 years of running and rebuilding and looking over her shoulder, and it ended in a front yard in Colorado on a Friday afternoon because she had people standing with her, because she had stopped running, because Wesley Keller had built a room and asked her to stay, and she had finally put her bag down. The sheriff rode over and tipped his hat and said he would keep an eye out for the next several days, but that he did not expect further trouble, and then he rode back toward town. Wesley walked from the gate to the porch and stood looking up at her. "All right," he said. She nodded. She realized she was shaking slightly, not from fear but from the release of something that had been held at tension for so long that the release of it felt physical. "All right," she said. He came up the porch steps and stood in front of her and looked at her face with the particular careful attention he gave to things that mattered to him, checking, she understood, not for damage but for truth. "He'll leave it alone," Wesley said. "Men like that don't go where the risk is clear." You called his hand and he folded. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." They stood very close together on the porch in the late afternoon light, and Lavinia looked at this man, this quiet, steady, particular man who had built a room before he said a word about what he felt, who had stood between her and her hidden danger without heroics or drama, just as a fact of what he was and how he moved through the world, and she put her hand against his jaw. He went very still. She said, "I would like to see the room." Something moved in his eyes, something deep and warm and carefully restrained. He said, "I'll show you." He took her around the outside of the house to the eastern end, where the new room's window was just beginning to catch the last of the afternoon light, and he opened the door and stood aside, and she went in. It was a good room. It was not large, but it was proportioned well, with the window on the east as she had noticed from outside and another smaller one on the south. And the floor was smooth pine that still smelled faintly of resin, and there was a simple shelf along one wall that he had made with the same careful craftsmanship as everything else she had observed him build. There was nothing in it yet, no furniture, no appointments, just the clean bare room with the evening light coming in and the smell of new wood. She turned around in the middle of the room and looked at him where he stood in the doorway. She said, "Wesley, are you asking me to marry you, or are you waiting for something?" He exhaled. She had the impression of a man releasing a breath he had been holding for quite a long time. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands, and he said, "I have been attempting to ask you that question by indirect means for approximately 6 weeks, and I was very much hoping you would help me get there directly." She laughed, and his thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she stopped laughing and looked at him, and he said, "Lavinia Harper, will you marry me and stay in this room and in this house and on this land and let me spend the rest of my working life in the considerable pleasure of your company?" She said, "Yes." He kissed her. It was not a tentative or introductory kind of kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been exceedingly patient and was now finished with that particular virtue. And Lavinia kissed him back with everything she had been holding back since approximately the 3rd week. And the new room with its pine floor and its east window held them in the fading August light. They were married at the Granger's Crossing Church on the 2nd Saturday of September 1882. The whole town came, which Lavinia had not expected, but which apparently Wesley had because he had made arrangements for food to be provided from the ranch, and had warned Mrs. Beaumont, the postmaster's wife, who served as the primary communications network of the town, approximately 2 weeks in advance, which had given Mrs. Beaumont ample time to ensure that the information was widely distributed. The church was filled with people Lavinia had spent 5 months slowly becoming known to, and she stood at the altar in a dress she had made herself from a length of blue cotton that Wesley did not know was the same bolt he had brought home from the general store 4 months earlier, and she faced the man she had come to Granger's Crossing running from her past and found instead her future. Wesley wore his best suit and had gotten his hair cut, and he looked at her with an expression that was so open and so steady, and so completely without pretense that Lavinia felt it like a physical warmth. The minister was a youngish man named Reverend Cole, who had only been in Granger's Crossing for a year, and had not yet acquired the particular rhythm of the long-established local clergy, which meant he said the words with a freshness that Lavinia found she preferred to the practiced performance she had observed in city churches. When he asked if she took Wesley Keller to be her husband, she said yes in a clear voice that carried to the back of the church, and she heard old Prout cough in a way that she was fairly certain was not entirely respiratory. After the ceremony, in the churchyard where the September air had the first whisper of autumn coolness in it, and the sky was the particular deep blue of Colorado in September, Wesley's ranch hand Sal shook Wesley's hand with the brevity of a man who expressed feeling through action rather than words, and then turned to Lavinia and said, "He's a good man, Mrs. Keller," which was the most he had said to her directly in 5 months and meant more to her for its economy. Mrs. Keller. She turned the name over in her mind as they drove back to the ranch in the wagon. Lavinia Keller. She had been Lavinia Harper her whole life, and before that she had gone by another name for 6 months in Denver, and now she was Lavinia Keller, and it fit her like the ranch house did, in the way that things fit that are built to a specific size rather than to a general one. They moved her things into the new room that evening, and Wesley had acquired a proper bed in the preceding weeks, a good iron-framed one from the store in town, and a washstand and a small mirror, and there were curtains on the east window that she had made herself from the remaining blue cotton. And the room was hers, and it was in the house they shared, and she stood in the middle of it in the lamplight, and felt something settle in her chest so completely that she understood what peace felt like after years of having forgotten. The first autumn of their marriage was a season of arriving. In the way that a traveler arrives at a destination they were not certain they would reach and keep stopping to verify that they are actually there. Lavinia would be doing ordinary things, managing the kitchen stores, or walking out to where Wesley was working to bring him something to eat in the midday, and the ordinariness of it would strike her with a force that was almost painful in its pleasure. Wesley was a good husband in the same way he was a good man, which was constitutionally and without effort. He did not idealize her, which she found she valued immensely, having been both idealized and vilified by other men, and finding neither accurate. He saw her clearly, noticed when she was troubled and inquired without insisting, noticed when she was content, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in that without requiring to be the cause of it. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with opinions who had learned to express those opinions, and the arguments were honest and usually brief and always resolved, which she found was a better pattern than either never arguing at all or never fully resolving what was argued. He began teaching her things about the ranch that she had not needed to know as a domestic manager, but that she asked about because she wanted to understand the full scope of the enterprise that was now hers as much as his. She learned the cattle, learned how to read the quality of the grass and what it meant for the herd's condition, learned the water management that was the constant concern of every rancher in Colorado, learned the mathematics of the operation, the costs, and the margins and the timing of the market. Wesley taught her these things without condescension, and with the clear assumption that she would learn quickly, which she did. She also discovered about 2 months into the marriage that she had skills he did not. She was better than he was with numbers, with the organizational complexity of managing multiple supply chains and the timing of orders, and when she began quietly reorganizing the account books and suggesting changes to the purchasing schedule, he looked at what she had done and said, with characteristic directness, "This is better. You should run this part." And that was that. She became the business brain of the Keller ranch, and it was a role she inhabited with a pleasure that surprised her, the pleasure of being used to full capacity. Tommy Reeves, the young hired hand who was 19 and eager, attached himself to Lavinia in the way that young people sometimes attach themselves to adults who treat them with consistent respect, and she found she was happy to be a kind of older sister figure to him. She helped him with his letters, which were uncertain, and he thanked her by being unfailingly helpful around the kitchen and the house in ways that were above his job description, which Prout observed with knowing amusement. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a hard one in Colorado, as winters there tended to be, with 2 significant blizzards in January that kept everyone on the ranch close and tested the cattle and the buildings and the people equally. They lost 7 head in the worst of the 2 storms, which was a serious loss but not a catastrophic one, and Wesley bore it with the equanimity of a man who had learned to hold the losses and the gains of ranch life with the same level hands. The winter also gave them the long evenings of snowbound closeness that Lavinia came to treasure. They read to each other by the lamp in the sitting room, Wesley's selections tending toward the practical and historical and hers toward the literary, and sometimes they disagreed about what they were reading in a way that generated conversations that lasted until the lamp oil was running low, and sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, and she thought about how silence with this man was one of the most nourishing things she had ever experienced. In February she told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning, before he went out to the barn, standing in the kitchen with the stove warm and the snow light coming through the window, and she watched his face do something she had never seen it do, which was go through about 6 separate expressions in rapid succession, before settling on the one that she would hold in her memory for the rest of her life, which was a kind of profound, wordless joy. The joy of a man who has wanted something for a long time, and finds it arriving not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of something real. He crossed the kitchen and held her, just held her, with his chin at the top of her head and his arms around her, and they stood like that in the warm kitchen with the February snow outside for a long time. She had a healthy pregnancy, in the practical sense, though the early months were difficult in the way they often were, and Wesley managed this with a combination of practical accommodation and unobtrusive care that she found exactly right. He ensured that her work was not beyond what she wanted to do, which required some negotiation, because she had no intention of becoming an invalid, and he endured her occasional irritability of the early months with the patience of a man who had decided that irritability was a reasonable price for any circumstance, and was not inclined to take it personally. By April she was feeling well and showing noticeably, and the news had moved through Granger's Crossing with the efficiency of a telegraph message, which meant that she was greeted everywhere in town with the particular warmth that a community directs at a pregnant woman who is well liked. Mrs. Beaumont at the post office gave her advice she had not asked for, which she accepted with grace and applied judiciously. Dr. Farnham, the town's physician, was a competent and serious man who examined her and told her that everything was proceeding well and that she was clearly a healthy woman, which she received as the professional assessment it was. The baby was born in November of 1883, a boy, in the new room with the east window, with Dr. Farnham attending and Mrs. George Aldermain assisting, who turned out to be an experienced and calming presence in a way that Lavinia was deeply grateful for. It was a hard labor, longer than it should have been, and there were hours in the night when Lavinia was afraid and did not hide it, which she had been prepared to do on the theory that fear was private, but found she could not manage in the reality of the experience. Wesley was outside the room, which was the custom and also probably safer for everyone, but she could hear him moving occasionally and knew he was there, and that knowledge was its own kind of steadying. The boy was born just before dawn, healthy and loud about his opinions, and Dr. Farnham brought him out to Wesley first because that was the protocol, and then brought him in to Lavinia, and she held her son in the first gray light of the November morning, and the exhaustion and the fear and the long months of waiting fell away, and what remained was so simple and so complete that it had no name. Wesley came in when Dr. Farnham indicated it was appropriate and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child and then at Lavinia and said nothing for a while, because there was nothing adequate to say, and then he said, "What do we call him?" And they had had this conversation before, but everything was different now in the real presence of the actual person, and she said, "I'd like to call him James." "For my father," and Wesley said, "James Keller," trying the sound of it, and nodded, and she saw that he was moved in a way that he was not trying to conceal. James Keller was an abundant, vigorous, opinionated baby who grew into an abundant, vigorous, opinionated child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination, and the combination was, from the earliest days, a constant source of both joy and considerable effort. The ranch grew in the years that followed. Not spectacularly, not in the way of the stories of the big cattle fortunes of that era, but solidly and sustainably, which was in many ways a better kind of growth. Lavinia's management of the business side tightened the operation's margins and allowed them to make improvements that Wesley had deferred for years out of uncertainty, and in 1885 they were able to add a second section of land to the east that expanded the herd capacity and gave them access to better water in the dry seasons. Tommy Reeves, who had grown from an eager 19-year-old into a competent and responsible young man of 23, fell in love in the summer of 1885 with the daughter of the Aldermain Ranch, a 20-year-old named Clara who had her father's practical good sense and her mother's warmth, and their courtship was conducted with the particular earnest anxiety of two young people who wanted very much to get it right. Lavinia observed this courtship with considerable affection and some amusement, and when Tommy came to Wesley one evening with his hat in his hands and asked for his opinion on the matter, Wesley said, with the quiet directness that was his signature, "I think you should ask her." And Tommy went the next day and asked her, and she said yes, and the Keller Ranch celebrated their wedding that October with genuine joy. Old Pruett's rheumatism worsened through the mid-1880s until his usefulness in the field was limited, and Wesley handled this with characteristic decency, keeping him on in a reduced capacity that preserved his dignity and gave him continued purpose. And Pruitt responded to this by becoming the primary babysitter of young James Keller, which he conducted with gruff affection that the boy reciprocated in the whole-hearted way of children who have not yet learned to be complicated about love. In 1886, Lavinia told Wesley she was pregnant again, and this time she told him at supper with James already in bed and the lamp burning between them on the table, and he looked at her across the lamp with a smile that she had come to know as one of the rare completely unguarded ones, the ones that showed up for things that reached past his considered exterior to the deep, abundant warmth she knew was there. "Good," he said simply. She laughed. "That's all you have to say. What else should I say?" "It's good, it is good," she agreed. The second child was born in March of 1887, another boy, and they named him Daniel. And where James had his father's eyes, Daniel had his mother's coloring, lighter-haired and hazel-eyed. And where James was forthright and loud about everything, Daniel was an observer, a watcher, a child who sat in corners and regarded the world with quiet intensity that Lavinia sometimes saw in Wesley's face and recognized with a particular tenderness. James Keller, who was 3.5 years old when Daniel arrived, was initially deeply uncertain about the new development, and expressed this uncertainty in the way of 3-year-olds everywhere and always, which was loudly and at inconvenient moments. Wesley handled this with the patience that Lavinia had come to rely on in him, taking James out to the barn and the fields with him in the mornings, giving him the particular gift of being included in the work. And within 6 weeks James had decided that his brother was acceptable and was attempting to teach the infant to do things that infants cannot do, which was touching and hilarious in equal measure. Sal, the quiet, experienced ranch hand, had stayed on through all the years and changes of the Keller Ranch with the steady fidelity of a man who had found a fair situation and recognized it for what it was. Lavinia had come to understand over time the weight of what that fidelity cost him in the larger world, which was not always kind to a black man in Colorado in the 1880s. She and Wesley had talked about this directly. In the direct way, they talked about things that mattered, and Wesley had made his position clear in the way he always made positions clear, which was through consistent action rather than pronouncement. Sal was paid the same as any hand of his skill and experience would be paid, treated with the same professional respect, and on the 2 occasions when someone in town had attempted to speak about him in terms that were degrading, Wesley had addressed this with a brevity and finality that left no room for continuation. Sal acknowledged none of this directly, which was his right, but once, when Lavinia was discussing the ranch's plans for the coming year and working through the account books at the kitchen table on a winter afternoon, he came in for coffee and looked at the books and said, without particular inflection, "You run a fair house, Mrs. Keller," and then took his coffee and went out, and she held that in her memory as one of the compliments she valued most. By the late 1880s, Granger's Crossing had grown considerably from the 400 people of 1882. The railroad had come through in 1884, transforming the town's relationship to the wider world and bringing a new wave of settlers and commerce that changed the character of the place in ways both good and complicated. New people arrived, new businesses, new social structures, and the tight intimacy of the small frontier community began to give way to something more like a town with ambitions, which brought opportunities and also brought the particular tensions of a place in transition. Lavinia found herself, somewhat to her surprise, becoming a central figure in the women's community of the growing town. She had not sought this role and did not particularly perform it, but she had a quality of clear-eyed practical intelligence combined with genuine warmth that drew people to her, and she had lived through enough to have perspective that others found useful. She helped organize a women's reading circle that became, over time, something more substantive, a place where the women of Granger's Crossing talked about the actual conditions of their lives, with a directness that the mixed-gender spaces of the community did not always allow. These conversations sometimes touched on matters that Wesley took note of without commenting on, the general subject of how women's lives in the West were shaped by forces they had limited formal power over. And one evening when she came home from a meeting of the group and was clearly both energized and frustrated, he listened to what she had to say for a long time and then said, "What would be most useful?" Which was such a perfect Wesley response that she kissed him before answering. James, at 6 years old, was enrolled in the new school that the railroad's expansion had made possible, a proper school with a qualified teacher named Miss Hartley who had come from Denver and was excellent. And his first year in the schoolroom confirmed Lavinia's suspicion that her elder son had her capacity for argument and his father's capacity for physical work, and the combination was going to require significant management over the coming years. In the spring of 1889, they received news from St. Louis that Marcus Holt had been convicted of fraud and extortion charges in that state and sentenced to a term in the federal penitentiary that would keep him there well into the next century. Wesley handed her the letter that had come through the legal channels she had set up years ago and said nothing, letting her read it and respond to it in her own time. She set the letter down on the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment, the fact of it, the complete closure of it, and then she looked up at Wesley and said, "That part of my life is entirely done." He said, "It's been done. This is just the paperwork." She loved him so much that she had no words for it and did not try to find them, just reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers. The summer of 1889 was a good one on the ranch. The cattle were in strong condition, the market price was favorable, and there had been enough rain in the spring that the grassland was as good as Lavinia had seen it. James was 7, and beginning to shadow his father on the weekend worked the way a 7-year-old shadows someone he is working to become, and Wesley gave this his serious attention in the way he gave all things he valued his serious attention. It was in that summer that Tommy Reeves and Clara had their first child, a girl they named Lily, and the Aldermain Ranch and the Keller Ranch were connected now by friendship and family that had grown from the years of proximity and shared work. And George Aldermain, who had been an older neighbor when Lavinia arrived and was now something closer to an uncle, came to the house one evening and sat on the porch and said that Granger's Crossing had turned out better than he had feared it might, which was the closest he came to sentiment and which she received accordingly. She was 33 years old that summer. She had been in Colorado for 7 years and at the Keller Ranch for most of them, and she knew this land now the way you know a thing you have lived with through all its seasons. The spring wildness when the creek ran fast and the grass came up faster than you expected. The particular summer heat that pressed down like a hand in July. The October smell of the turning aspen on the hills to the north. The crystalline winter cold that you could not describe to someone who had not stood in it. She was standing in the kitchen one August morning, with the east window of the new room catching the first light, and Wesley came in from the barn and stopped in the kitchen doorway watching her in that way he sometimes did when he did not know she was aware of it, the way of someone who looks at something and thinks this is the thing I built my life around and is grateful for it, and she turned and caught him. "I know you're doing that," she said. "Doing what?" looking at me like I'm a good piece of land. He considered this. "That's the best compliment I know how to give," he said. She laughed. "I know, that's why it works." He came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and said, "James wants to know if he can help with the branding this fall. He's 7. I know when he was born. He'll get in the way, probably, but he'll also learn something." She thought about this. "All right, but not the fire part." "Obviously not the fire part," he said with mild offense, and she laughed again. These were the days. Not the dramatic ones. Not the confrontations and the revelations and the moments that held the shape of stories. But these ordinary days. These kitchen mornings and supper evenings and long riding afternoons and porch nights. These days that were the actual substance of the life she had not believed she would have. These days that were the answer to everything she had fled and hidden from and rebuilt herself toward. In 1890, Daniel, who was 3, began demonstrating the capacity for language that suggested he had inherited the best of both his parents in the verbal department, producing sentences of structural complexity and sometimes daunting accuracy that reduced Prout, who was now largely retired but still present on the ranch in a comfortable reduced capacity, to a state of helpless delight. Daniel would explain things to Prout with the patient thoroughness of a small person who has decided that the old man needs assistance understanding the world, and Prout would receive these explanations with the gravity they deserved, and then wink at Lavinia over the boy's head. Prout died in the winter of 1891, peacefully, in his sleep, in the bunkhouse that had been his home for 15 years. He was somewhere past 70, no one knew exactly, and he had lived his last several years in the particular contentment of a man who had outlasted his hardest work, and found himself in a place where he was valued and comfortable. Wesley buried him on the ranch, which was what Prout had asked for, on the rise to the north of the house where you could see the whole spread of the grassland in one view, and the small group that gathered there, Wesley and Lavinia and Sal and Tommy and Clara and the children and the aldermans, were quiet in the way of people saying goodbye to someone who had been consistently good. James, who was 8 and had the directness of both his parents, asked his father at the graveside if Prout was in heaven. Wesley said, with the honesty he gave to everything, "I think if there's a heaven, it's the kind of place that makes room for a man like Prout." James considered this and then nodded and seemed satisfied, and Daniel held Lavinia's hand and watched everything with his hazel eyes. In the spring of 1892, Lavinia discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time, at 36 years old, and told Wesley at the breakfast table with the boys in the room because James, at 9, could be trusted with information, and Daniel, at 5, would not fully understand it. Wesley looked at her and his face went through its characteristic rapid private sequence of expressions and arrived at joy. "You're happy," she said. "I'm always happy when you tell me this," he said. James, who had in fact understood the conversation, said, "Is it a baby again?" With the resigned acceptance of a 9-year-old who has been through this once before and knows what it means in terms of household disruption. "Yes," Lavinia said. "Will it cry as much as Daniel did?" Wesley said. "Every baby is different," which was the diplomatic answer, and Lavinia said, "Almost certainly yes," which was the honest one, and James sighed with a depth that Lavinia thought was slightly theatrical but which she kept to herself. The 3rd child, born in November of 1892, was a girl, and they named her Ruth, and she arrived in the world with a volume and a certainty of opinion that suggested she had made a careful assessment of the family she was joining, and decided that she would need to establish her position clearly from the outset. James, who had been resigned about the prospect of another sibling, took one look at his sister and fell completely in love with her, which surprised Lavinia and delighted Wesley and became one of the constants of the years that followed. Daniel, who was 5 when Ruth was born, brought her things. It was his primary mode of expressing affection at that age, the bringing of objects he considered interesting or beautiful or useful, and so Ruth's cradle was often surrounded by rocks and feathers, and once a very surprised frog that Lavinia dealt with diplomatically and firmly. Sal left the ranch in 1893. He had been offered a position as foreman on a larger operation to the south, a position that reflected his genuine experience and skill and paid him accordingly, and he came to tell Wesley about it on a Tuesday morning with the directness of a man who knows what he is doing and why and respects the person he is telling enough to tell them straight. Wesley shook his hand and said, "You've been the best kind of worker there is, Sal, which is the kind who does the right thing whether anyone is watching or not." And Sal said, "So have you." And they looked at each other for a moment in the way of men who have worked alongside each other for years and know each other through the language of shared labor. Lavinia packed a box of food for the road, which Sal accepted without protest, and she said, "I hope the next place treats you fairly." And he said, "I'll make sure of it," and she believed him entirely. They hired 2 new hands that spring, a brother and sister combination that was unusual but not unprecedented in Colorado in the 1890s, Pete and Annie Goff, who had come west from Missouri with good references and better skills. And Annie Goff, who was 28 and had worked cattle since she was a girl, proved within the first month that she was one of the best hands Wesley had ever had, which was received by Wesley as a plain fact, and by most of the surrounding ranches as a conversation, which Lavinia observed with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a woman who had encountered that particular conversation many times in her own history. By the mid-1890s, the Keller Ranch was a settled and prosperous operation, not the largest in the county but among the most reliably run, and Lavinia and Wesley had arrived at the kind of marriage that is the result of years of genuine work at it. Not the easy marriage of perfect temperamental compatibility, but the deeper one of 2 people who have seen each other clearly through difficulty and chosen each other consistently anyway. They still argued sometimes, still disagreed on things that mattered, still had the occasional evening when the day had been hard and patience was thin, and none of that diminished what they were to each other, which was home. James turned 13 in 1895 and began the business of becoming an adult with the same wholehearted intensity he brought to everything, and Wesley managed the transition of their relationship from father of a boy to father of a young person, with a thoughtfulness that Lavinia watched with private admiration. He did not try to hold James in the shape he had been, did not resist the changes, but paid attention to who his son was becoming and adjusted accordingly. James, for his part, was in most ways a good young man, and in some ways a challenging one, and in all ways exactly himself, which was what Lavinia had raised him to be. Daniel at 8 was reading everything he could find in the house and the town library that the new community hall had established, and Lavinia observed this with the recognition of a kindred spirit. She began ordering books specifically for him from Denver, and his gratitude for this was expressed in his characteristically indirect way, which was to bring her things still, even at 8, the bringing of things having never fully left him. Ruth at 3 was ruling the household. There was no other word for it. She had assessed the power structures of the Keller Ranch and concluded, with what appeared to be excellent reasoning, that she was capable of improving them, and she went about this project with an energy and a confidence that made her brothers alternately exasperated and utterly devoted. The summer of 1895 brought an unexpected development when a woman named Helena Price arrived in Granger's Crossing as the new schoolteacher, the previous excellent Miss Hartley having married and moved to Denver. And Helena Price was 24 years old and came from Philadelphia with a teacher's certificate and an expression of determined cheerfulness that Lavinia recognized immediately as the expression of a young woman who is slightly terrified and refusing to show it. She had Helena to the ranch for Sunday dinner within 2 weeks of her arrival and began the process of making sure that the town's newest resident felt welcomed in ways that mattered, because Lavinia remembered what it was to be new and uncertain, and trying to appear more certain than you were. Helena became a friend, which was a particular pleasure at an age when new friendships form less easily. And through Helena and the school, Lavinia became more involved in the education of the community's children than she had been, contributing her organizational skills to a project to expand the school's library and eventually, by 1896, sitting on the new school committee that administered the education budget, a role that required her to attend meetings with county officials, and that drew on every skill she had developed over 14 years of running the Keller Ranch's business side. At one of these meetings, she found herself in a politely persistent dispute with a county official named Harrison, who kept assuming that the representative from the Keller Ranch would be the rancher rather than the rancher's wife, until she had demonstrated, over the course of about 45 minutes, that she knew the relevant numbers and regulations better than anyone else in the room. At which point Harrison recalibrated with the grace of someone who recognized a tactical error, and they proceeded on equal terms. She told Wesley about this over supper, and he said, "How long did it take him to realize?" And she said, 45 minutes, and he said, "That's faster than most," which made her laugh. In 1897, the town of Granger's Crossing reached a population of nearly 1,500 people and had acquired a second school, a bank, a proper hotel with a restaurant, and 2 new churches, and the wild and open quality of the frontier town that Lavinia had arrived in was largely gone now, replaced by something more settled and complex and in many ways more comfortable and in some ways less honest, which was the universal exchange that happened when frontier became town. She found she did not entirely mourn the rawer earlier version. She had come here running from something, and the rawness had served her need for a place that did not look too closely and ask too many questions. But she had stayed and built a life, and the building had been better served by the town around her building as well. James Keller, 15 in 1897, was working the ranch full-time in the summers, and had developed into a young man of quiet capability that surprised even people who had watched him grow up, because the loud and opinionated boy had become a thoughtful and skilled young rancher who could read cattle and weather and land with an accuracy that Wesley acknowledged directly and with genuine pride. Daniel, 12, was the best student in the Granger's Crossing School, and already the subject of Miss Price's quiet lobbying that he should be sent to college in Denver or further, which Lavinia thought about with a complicated mixture of pride and preemptive grief. Ruth at 5 was Ruth, an ongoing and compelling proposition. The last years of the century brought changes to the West that were larger than any single town or ranch. The open range era was definitively ending. The great cattle drives that had defined the earlier decades had become economically irrelevant with the expansion of the railroad network, and the character of ranching was shifting toward more intensive and managed operations. The Keller Ranch had never been the kind of wild open-range operation that needed to change dramatically, having always been managed with the careful attention that was Wesley's character. But the broader changes meant shifts in market relationships and land management questions that they spent considerable time working through in the late 1890s. In 1899, with the century coming to its end and Lavinia 43 years old and Wesley 49, and their children 15, 14, and 7 respectively, they sat one evening on the porch that faced west across the grassland, the same porch they had sat on in the early weeks, in the same chairs, with the same view that the intervening 17 years had made familiar without making ordinary. The evening light was doing the thing it did in September, the long horizontal gold that made everything it touched look permanent and significant. Wesley said, "Do you remember when you were going to leave?" She looked at him. "You mean when I came out with my bag and you were standing in the yard?" "Yes. I remember every second of it." He was quiet for a moment. "So do I." He looked out across the grass. "I didn't know if you would stay. I had built the room, but I didn't know." "You seemed very certain," she said. I was certain about the room. I wasn't certain about you. He glanced at her, the familiar quality of his attention, the seeing quality of it. You were the bravest person I had ever met, and you didn't know it yet. She reached over and put her hand in his. He laced his fingers through hers with the ease of 17 years of doing exactly that. I was terrified, she said. I know. That's what brave means. They sat with the evening coming down, and the grass bending in the late air. And in the house behind them, their youngest child was almost certainly doing something she had been told not to do. And their middle son was reading by lamplight in the room that had been built for her, which Daniel had claimed as his own study, with the confidence of someone who understands that rooms are for the people who need them. And their eldest son was in the barn doing the last checks on the horses, with the attentiveness of someone who has learned to love the responsibility of things. In the year 1900, Lavinia Keller sat down and wrote a letter to the Denver Post, not the letter's page, but to the editor directly. A careful and well-argued letter about the conditions of women settlers in the Colorado Territory and the specific legal and practical constraints that shaped those conditions, drawing on everything she had observed and experienced and discussed in the reading circle that had continued and grown through the years. The letter was published with her full name and generated a response from readers across the state that surprised her considerably in its volume and its depth. She wrote another letter, and then another, and then a longer piece, more like an essay, that the paper published in its Saturday edition. And by the end of 1900, she was corresponding regularly with editors in Denver and with a women's organization in Colorado Springs that was working on issues of women's property rights, which was a live and important question in Colorado, one of the first states to grant women the vote, which had occurred back in 1893. Wesley read everything she wrote always and said very little about it directly, but she noticed that he kept the copies. She found them one day in his desk drawer, folded carefully, every piece she had published, and she stood in front of the open drawer for a moment and then closed it gently and did not mention it. The new century arrived on a cold January night in Granger's Crossing with the ringing of the church bell and the distant sound of celebration from the direction of town. And the Keller family was awake for it, by the simple chance that Ruth had had a nightmare and come into her parents' room at midnight. And the bell and the celebration had made her decide that the nightmare was not the most interesting thing happening, and she should investigate the noise. And so they had all gone out on the porch in coats and blankets and watched the town of Granger's Crossing ring in the 20th century under a sky packed with January stars. James, 17, stood at the edge of the porch looking toward the town with an expression that Lavinia recognized as the expression of a young person measuring their life against the horizon of everything that is coming, the measuring that happens in the gap between who you are and who you intend to be. Daniel, 15, was looking at the stars, actually looking at them, cataloging them with the quiet, systematic attention that was his nature. Ruth, 8, was sitting on Wesley's shoulders, because this had seemed to her a reasonable way to see better, and Wesley was standing with his hands around her ankles in the patient manner of a man who has long since made his peace with the particular demands of his youngest child, and she was pointing at the stars and asking what they were called with the inexhaustible appetite for information that had characterized her from the earliest age. Lavinia stood in the cold January night of 1900 on the porch of the house that had been built around the room that Wesley had built for her, and she looked at her family, and at the dark grass stretching away to the hills, and at the bright scattered stars above the hills, and at the man she had come here running and found herself instead arriving at, and she felt the whole shape of her life as a single thing. The fear and the hiding and the moment of decision and the room and the years and the children and the work and the love, all of it continuous and all of it hers. Ruth leaned down from Wesley's shoulders and said, loudly into his ear, "Papa, what is the biggest star called?" He said, "Ask your mother, she knows." Ruth turned and looked at Lavinia with the commanding expectation of a child who has learned that her parents are reliable sources. Lavinia looked at her daughter's face, vivid and intent and completely herself in the January starlight, and said, "Come down and I will show you." And Wesley lifted Ruth down, and she came and stood beside Lavinia, and Lavinia put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and pointed up. In the spring of 1901, James told them he intended to stay on the ranch, to make it his life's work, which was both the thing Wesley had hoped for and the thing he had tried very carefully never to push toward, wanting the decision to be his son's own. James said it plainly at the supper table one April evening, the way he said everything, and Wesley received it with a nod that contained a great deal. And Lavinia watched her husband and her eldest son look at each other across the table in the particular way of people who are recognizing each other across a generational distance, and understood that something important had settled. Daniel, in the autumn of that year, left for the University of Colorado in Boulder with a trunk of books and a letter of introduction from Helena Price, and a composure that Lavinia found both admirable and heartbreaking, in the way that all departures are heartbreaking when the person departing is someone you love. Wesley drove him to the train at Granger's Crossing, and they were gone for 3 hours, and when Wesley came back, he was quieter than usual and went out to the barn for a while before supper, and Lavinia let him have that time. Ruth, at 9, received Daniel's departure as both a loss and an opportunity, the opportunity being his former room in the house, which she immediately requested as her own. They gave her the room. It was the room that had started as Lavinia's, the room Wesley had built that first summer, and now it became Ruth's, and on the first night she slept in it she said at breakfast the next morning, "That is the best room," with a completeness of satisfaction that required no further comment. In 1903, James Keller, 21 years old, met the woman he would eventually marry, a rancher's daughter from the next county named Ellen Graves, who came to Granger's Crossing with her family for a church social, and sat next to James at the supper table, and had a conversation with him about cattle water management that apparently was compelling enough that James thought about it for the entire following week before writing her a letter. Lavinia found out about the letter by accident, in the way that mothers find out about things that are not intended for their knowledge, and she and Wesley discussed it with the private delight of parents watching their child venture into the territory they themselves have navigated. Ellen came to the ranch in the summer of 1903, and Lavinia liked her immediately, which she had been careful not to assume she would, because that kind of assumption was its own form of pressure. Ellen was practical and direct, and had a humor that showed up sideways in her observations, and she looked at James with the specific quality of attention that Lavinia recognized as the beginning of something serious, and James looked at Ellen with the expression of a young man who has encountered someone he cannot quite categorize and finds this profoundly interesting. They were married in 1905 in the Granger's Crossing Church, in a ceremony that filled the pews with people whose connections traced back through 23 years of the Keller Ranch's history in that community. And Lavinia stood in the front row beside Wesley and watched her son marry a good woman, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a life built well enough to have its own continuation. Daniel came back from Boulder for the wedding with a degree and a plan to study further, to go to law, which was no surprise to anyone who had watched him read everything in Reach since he was 8. He was tall now, 20 years old, serious and kind, and still bringing things to people he cared about, still the observer in the corner cataloging the world. He told Lavinia at the wedding reception, in the careful way of someone who has been thinking about how to say something for a while, that the work she had published, the letters and essays from the beginning of the century, had been used in one of his courses at the university as examples of frontier women's voices, and that the professor had not known the author was his mother until he had mentioned it. He said this with a quiet pride that undid her completely. She said, "Daniel." He said, "You should write more." She said, "I intend to." And she did. The years of the new century gave her more to write about and more opportunity to write it, and the women's rights work that had begun with the reading circle in the 1880s had grown into something connected to the larger national conversation. And Lavinia Keller's voice in that conversation, rooted in the specific experience of a woman who had built a life on the Colorado frontier on her own terms, was distinctive and was recognized. Wesley read everything she wrote, still always. She knew because she sometimes saw him in his chair in the sitting room in the evenings with a page of her work, reading with the quiet concentration he gave to things that mattered. And when she asked him once what he thought, he said, "I think you say things that need to be said." And she had no adequate response to that, so she kissed him. And he received this with the dignified pleasure of a man who has been married for 23 years and is not tired of being kissed. In 1906, Ruth turned 14 and had become a person of ferocious curiosity and capability, who had already decided that she wanted to be a physician, which she announced at the supper table in the spring of that year, with the completeness of conviction that had always characterized her declarations. And Lavinia and Wesley received this without a blink, which Ruth had perhaps not been expecting, since she had clearly prepared for an argument. Wesley said, "Dr. Farnham would probably talk to you about it," and Ruth said, "I already talked to him," and they all laughed. The Keller Ranch in 1907 was a three-generation operation, with James and Ellen running the cattle side and Lavinia still managing the business accounts, and Wesley doing less of the physical work now but present in everything. The kind of presence that is less about labor and more about knowledge and character. The presence of someone who built the thing and therefore contains it in their understanding. He was 57 years old, and his dark hair had gone mostly gray, and he moved with slightly more deliberation than he had at 32. But he moved with the same quality of intention, the same unhurried certainty. And Lavinia looked at him across whatever room they were in, and still felt the specific warmth that had been with her since that April in 1882, when he had driven her from the stage to the ranch in a wagon that smelled of hay. James and Ellen had a son in 1907, a boy they named William, and the Keller Ranch had its third generation. Lavinia held her grandson in the morning light of the room where her own children had been born and thought about how a life builds, not in the direction you plan, but in the direction of what you actually are. And what you actually are is made by every choice you make, and every person you choose, and every morning you get up and decide to stay. She had decided to stay on an August afternoon in 1882 when a quiet man put down her traveling bag and gestured at a room he had built and said, "I built that second room for when you stay." And the rest of it, all the rest of it, had grown from that decision the way a ranch grows from a piece of land, year by year, season by season, work by work, until what stands there is so fully itself that you cannot separate what was planted from what grew. In the evenings in the autumn of 1907, when the light came across the grass at the long golden angle that meant the year was turning, Wesley and Lavinia sat on the west-facing porch in the same chairs they had sat in since the first weeks, chairs worn now to the specific shapes of two people who had been sitting in them for 25 years. And they watched the light go out of the Colorado sky in the same progression that had been reliable and spectacular and specific to this place, in all the years they had watched it together. Sometimes they talked about the ranch or the children or the writing she was working on or the particular quality of the season. Sometimes they sat in the silence that had been one of the first things she had noticed about being with him, the silence that was full rather than empty, the silence of two people who have said enough over enough years that they can rest in the not saying. One evening in October, with the first real cold of autumn in the air and the aspen on the northern hills turned the specific gold that you could see from the porch if the light was right, Wesley said, out of the quiet and without particular preamble, the way he said things that had been waiting in him for a while, "I do it all the same." She looked at him. He was looking out at the grass, his hands easy on the arms of his chair. Every single thing, he said. The same way, I'd build the room before I said anything. I'd let you tell me in your own time. I'd stand at the gate when Holt came. He turned and looked at her, and in his face was everything that had been there since the beginning, the steadiness, the honesty, the deep and particular warmth. I'd choose this every time. Lavinia Harper, who had come to the Colorado frontier running from her past and found her future in the form of a quiet man and a room with an east window, who had stayed when everything in her said run, and discovered that staying was the bravest and best thing she had ever done, reached across and took her husband's hand in the October evening and said, "So would I, Wesley, every single time." The light went out of the western sky by degrees, the colors cycling through their slow sequence of orange and rose and purple, and the Keller ranch settled into the dark around them. The cattle in the fields and the house lit warm behind them, and the children's children asleep in their beds, and the whole built thing of the life they had made together as present and solid as the land under their feet, as permanent as the work of 25 years of choosing each other in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that a life offers for choosing, as sure and as good and as done as anything in this world ever gets to be. The stars came out over Granger's Crossing. Lavinia Keller looked up at them, the same stars that had been there since before any of this, since before the ranch and the room and the day she had arrived with her bag in both hands and her secrets in her coat pocket and her whole frightened brave heart, and she thought, "I am home. I have been home for 25 years. She held her husband's hand. The wind moved through the grass. The lamp in the east window burned.